I want to thank the 𝐒𝐮 County Library for inviting me, and thank you all for showing up early on a Saturday morning to listen to me talk a bit about our book. And I have to say, this is especially nice for me because my co-author, Pat Shull, actually grew up in 𝗏𝗏 County for the most part, and I know she would have been really, really happy to have this event here in her, what amounted to her hometown in Brick Township. The project itself, I should say, was very much of a departure from my previous research and something very new for me as well as for my wife Pat. My previous research and writing had primarily been in the area of religious history as well as public history and archives. And my wife, who had taught at the College of St. Elizabeth in Morristown, was involved in English education throughout her career, so this was her first foray into history. But the book turned out to be a rather exciting and invigorating foray into such topics as local history, legal history, and the ways in which capital punishment played out over the course of the 19th century. And it also placed me very much in touch with my own landscape and local surroundings, which I think is also very important. We had lived in West Orange for about 27 years, but it mainly functioned as a community suburb. And we lived in a modest and modified Cape Cod home built in the 1940s in a nice neighborhood. I took the bus daily into New York City and pretty much took the town for granted as a bedroom community, never thinking very much about it. And that changed several years ago when someone gave me a 19th century property map of my neighborhood as a little holiday gift. Now, the arrow here on this slide pretty much indicates roughly where my house was now located. The street itself, Rock Spring Avenue, did not exist in 1881, the date of the map, nor did the house. Rather, the place seemed to be encompassed as part of a modest rectangular plot of land owned by someone named John Meierhofer. So basically, I thought I would play around a little bit and mainly see if I could find anything out about this former property owner. Initially, I had no luck. The 1880 US Census did not mention him, nor did any city directories. So I started randomly Googling around and found only one reference to him on an old New Jersey genealogy listserv, which contained only one cryptic sentence. John Meierhofer died 1879, shot in head. So quite naturally, this piqued my curiosity, and I decided to see if I could go a bit further. Now at the time, no New Jersey newspapers had been digitized when I started my research, but I knew that the New York Times website did contain all out-of-copyright editions, so I searched through all the 1879 issues to see if they might have covered this local story. So sure enough, I hit pay dirt when the October 11th edition contained a prominent story with the alluring title, "A Tramp Kills a Farmer," and also had a suggested subhead, "The Victim's Wife, a Party to the Murder." This story, based largely on sources within the Orange Police Department, pretty much laid out the structure of the narrative that would play out in subsequent newspaper coverage and trial testimony. It described the victim, John Meierhofer, as, quote, "an elderly German farmer and dairyman of eccentric habits," unquote. And his mental condition and stability would remain a key matter of discussion throughout the trial. And also claimed that, quote, "criminal relations," which was another way of saying sexual relations, existed between Margaret Meierhofer, John's wife, and Frank Lamon's the tramp and hired hand, who was also charged with murder. And the salacious story also became an important piece of the proceedings as time went on. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a background on West Orange in 1880, because I think landscape became an important part of the story as well. The population of 3,385 was almost exclusively white, but it had been touched by early 19th century immigration patterns. Roughly 23% of the inhabitants were Irish, and another 10% were German. As far as occupation, the financial, professional, and mercantile sectors took up about 15% of the population. Service-related industries, primarily maids, coachmen, and that sort of thing, composed about 31%. Manufacturing, primarily in the hatting industry, took up 21%. About 14% were unskilled laborers, and farmers, who, as we'll see, are a declining percentage of the population, were about 9%. Now, the 1870s were a depression decade in American history. Following the Panic of 1873, at that time, the late 1870s constituted the largest and most long-lived depression in American history. There was massive unemployment, business failures, and labor strife, all of which affected West Orange and Essex County. The town itself was institutionally very weak, and it depended primarily on the neighboring and more urban city of Orange for all of its services. There was no police department, no fire department, no high school, no newspaper, no post office, no banks, no Catholic churches, and few clubs or fraternal institutions. It did, however, boast a several pretty clearly defined neighborhoods and some outlying settlements in 1880. The most famous was 𝗲𝗏𝗏 Park, which had this iconic, almost fairy tale-like gatehouse on Main Street, which still exists. And it's generally considered to be the first romantically planned residential park in the United States. And it was laid out by probably the most prominent landscape architect of the day, Alexander Jackson Davis. And it advertised itself as containing country homes for city people. It was a private and closed-off community. It had very rustic and naturalistic winding parkways and a really rural kind of look. And it was initially populated by bohemians, abolitionists, freethinkers, and intellectuals. By 1880, however, that initial group had been displaced by bankers, merchants, manufacturers, and lawyers.
That's where I'm going.
Another important neighborhood in the community was called Mountain Ridge. And that was a small, gated, wealthy enclave, primarily populated by the failed Civil War general George McClellan and his relatives. And these contained large mansions and gated houses. This is McClellan's property, all of which contained plentiful servants and large staffs. McClellan himself received his 1864 presidential nomination here when he unsuccessfully challenged Abraham Lincoln. And at the time of the Meierhofer murder, he was serving as governor of New Jersey and trying to resurrect his political career. St. Cloud, which was near the Meierhofer residence, was a real estate development that had begun in the 1860s. It was solidly middle class. The houses were laid out in a grid. There were no gates, and it was kind of down the road from the Meierhofer farm. And it was a robust community until the 1870s when the initial developer declared bankruptcy. And after that, it grew pretty slowly. And this home, which still exists today, gives you a sense of what the housing stock was like. And then there was the valley. And that was the industrial area that bordered Orange. Workers there who were concentrated on several small and crowded streets were primarily involved in the hatting industry. It was heavily Irish and German, and it was physically very isolated from the middle class developments that were up the hill. And then there were the farmers. Initially, the town consisted primarily of farmers with large estates that then began being subdivided in the 1840s and 1850s. The farms were concentrated on several major east-west and north-south arteries, and they were overrepresented by Germans who had bought up a lot of that property to maintain, at a certain point, small family farms. But farming was in decline by 1880 as, again, the initial farmers began selling off their large estates. So by 1880, many of the farms were marginal or subsistence in nature. And this is from a postcard called A Lonely Road on Orange Mountain, which is kind of where the Meierhofer murder took place. Now, getting into the people involved in this story, Margaret Clem was the wife, and John Meierhofer was the husband. And this slide kind of lays out a lot of the contrasts between the two, but there were also several similarities which I'll mention. Margaret and John were both immigrants from Bavaria, which had suffered through severe economic crises in the 1840s and early 1850s. And if you're familiar with Irish immigration, it was very, very similar. The southern provinces of Germany in particular, of which Bavaria was one, suffered through potato rot, famine, people were being forced off their lands, and there were a number of hunger riots. And a lot of this played out as immigration to the United States. Prior to the early 1850s, roughly 60,000 Germans a year came to the United States. Now that figure jumped to 400,000 a year by the early 1850s. Margaret had arrived at about the age of 12 in 1853. Now with John, whose entire biography is very sketchy, we really don't know. Margaret initially came to New York, but she moved to Orange Valley, which was that area, the hatting area, primarily, I think, to be close to her brothers who were in Livingston and serving as farmers, and her mother, who also lived with one of her brothers in Livingston. Margaret initially worked as a domestic and a nursemaid to a carriage manufacturer in Orange, and John was boarding with someone next door to her and kind of knocking around as a day laborer in the same neighborhood. And I think that's basically where they met. They eventually purchased the farm from one of Margaret's brothers, and Margaret basically became the manager of the farm. She planted all the crops, she raised produce, she sold goods at market in Orange and Newark, she hawked butter and milk to grocers who were traversing the Northfield Road, which is where the farm was located. She supplied fruits and vegetables to residents of St. Cloud. She tended to the farm animals. She took in young male boarders, primarily carpenters and painters who were working on the mountain. And she took in watch from the local community. Now, as this slide indicates, there were a lot of contrasts between the two. Margaret was 18 years old when she got married. John, although his age is a little not really known, was roughly in his mid-30s, so he was about 20 years older than Margaret. Margaret was a big woman. She was 6 foot and weighed 170 pounds. John Meierhofer, on the other hand, was 5 foot 2.5, and usually described as having a slight and sickly build. Margaret was embedded in her extended family. Again, she had brothers living up in Livingston. John Meierhofer, from what I can tell, was a loner with no familial ties. No one showed up to support him at the trial. No family existed to attend to his burial, and he seemed to have no brothers and sisters. As mentioned, Margaret had brokered a relationship between John and her brothers to purchase her farm up on a mountain. John pretty much functioned as an unskilled laborer. Although he was described in the newspaper as having been a farmer, there was no indication that he ever really did any serious work on the farm. While Margaret managed the farm, John pretty much played no economic role. They had 2 children, Joseph, who was born shortly after their marriage in 1859, and Theodore, who was born in 1866. John, for whatever reason, decided to register for the draft and was inducted into the military in 1864. Now, when John came back from military service, he grew increasingly erratic. Neighbors described him as someone who was wandering around the property, muttering to himself and not doing any real work. He started sleeping in the barn with the farm animals, and their marital relations clearly ceased. He refused to eat with the family. He would just at random parts of the day go to the pantry and take out whatever he felt like eating. And he also started beating Margaret and beating his eldest son, Joseph. Margaret had called the police in Orange on him several times, but nothing happened. He also cut Margaret off from her family. When her brothers would come to visit, basically what he would do was shake his fist at them and warn them off the property. Newspaper articles described him as, quote, one of the lowliest men that was to be found within New Jersey's borders, a poor, worn out, ignorant, and demented farmer.
That's saying a lot.
Yeah, he had a lot of competition. The third member of the group that constitutes the heart of this story was someone named Frank Lamens. Now, Frank had been born in the rural maritime province of Holland around 1835, and he arrived in the United States in 1952, pretty much alone and with no family. And this was very odd for Dutch families who tended to immigrate as groups and who often ended up in the Midwest on various farms. But he was alone, and he clearly had no family. And he worked as a drifter and an itinerant laborer throughout the northeastern United States. In 1861, however, he married a woman named Bridget Fallon, either in Jamaica, Queens, or Flushing. It's not quite clear. They moved to Brooklyn, and he had 3 children, and he worked as kind of a huckster and a hustler throughout Brooklyn. Unfortunately, his children all died in the early 1860s, and that set off another period of rootlessness for him. He abandoned his wife. He engaged in a series of petty crimes. Again, he became very ruthless and was involved in a lot of petty larceny. He eventually was arrested and was sent to Sing Sing, after which he was transferred to the Auburn Asylum for the Criminal Insane in Western New York. Now, when he was released from the Albany Asylum, his life took an even worst turn. He once again turned to a life of crime. He ended up in Cleveland, Ohio for a while. Then he came back to New York and was just sort of wandering around the area. And he eventually ended up at the Meierhofer farm, in his words, looking for a light of his cigarette and a smoke. So Margaret spoke with him for a while and then decided to hire him on as a farm laborer because it was in September and she was looking to, harvest various materials on the farm. And that leads us to the murder. And there were two conflicting accounts of the murder, which happened on October 9th, 1879. Margaret claimed that for roughly a week or two before the murder, Frank had been making a series of sexual advances toward her. And he increasingly was looking to her as a sexual partner. Things got progressively worse, and she was going to fire him. But on the morning of October the 9th, he showed up in her bedroom and threatened, in her words, to cut her throat and blow up the place unless she had sex with him. So Margaret sent her youngest son, Theodore, to Orange early in the morning to summon the police, but the police refused to investigate. They claimed that there was always trouble around the place. They didn't believe Theodore's story, and they never went out to the farm at all. Now, according to a school teacher who was boarding on the property, Lamons and John Meierhofer were arguing all morning. John then went out to dig up some potatoes and carry them down to the basement. Frank followed him with his Victor #2 pistol, shot him, and kicked him down the stairs into the basement. Margaret claimed that for the rest of the day, she was living in fear. A number of people showed up at the farm during the day, but John continued to threaten her, forced her to hide in a closet, and gave her no opportunity to escape. He also said that his plan was to cut off John Meierhofer's head, throw it in the furnace, take his body, throw it in a hay cart, and dump it in the Passaic River, which once again is a classic New Jersey kind of way. Finally, in the evening, she convinced the school teacher to go back down to Orange, down the mountain, which was actually a substantial trip, asking again that her sentence be commuted from execution to life in prison, but none of that had any effect. So, in 1880, despite these unsuccessful petitions, the death sentence was pronounced, and both defendants were executed on the Feast of the Epiphany in 1881. This is the only visual depiction that I was able to find of the actual execution, and it was from a tabloid called the National Police Gazette, which primarily covered sports and crime. And you see this one kind of focused a lot on the Benedictines, Margaret praying for the priests, and Margaret ultimately being hung in the Newark City jail in 1881. It's a bit inaccurate in the sense that you see all those people looking over the fence. That never really happened because the Newark police were quite careful to shield the execution from public view and not turn it into a spectacle. Her funeral took place from St. Mary's German Church in Newark, and that turned into a really raucous fit. The church was filled to overflow. There were hundreds of people in the streets, and it became very much a cause célèbre in Newark. The wake was held at one of her brother's homes in East Newark, and the crowds were so enormous that he ultimately had to bar entry to the home and close it down. Crowds lined the route as her procession went from East Newark to St. Mary's Church over here, where again the overflow crowds filled the pews and spilled into the streets. Her younger son Theodore had a final request to open the coffin so that he could have one last glimpse of his mother, but the priests denied that, since the Benedictines feared that a riot would take place. The hearse was taken to 𝗍𝗵𝗂𝗀𝗃 Cemetery, where Margaret was interred, and her remains to this day are in an unmarked grave in what was described as the poor section of the cemetery near the gate that separates the cemetery from exit 145 of the Garden State Park. So that's basically the story. There's kind of a lot more to it, but in the interest of time, I tried to sort of just give you a little bit of an overview.
Support public libraries. Like, share, and subscribe for more great videos.